Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. So being a vendor process manager is a little like being a referee, detective, and data janitor all at once. So in this episode, I'm going to cover the key priorities that help you reduce risk, improve compliance, and just clean up some vendor chaos. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 398. Do you manage the vendor process? Start here to build controls, manage risk, and maintain accurate vendor data. Now, I know many of you have been listening to my podcast for a while, and every now and again, I will talk about how I was a practitioner just like you. I was a vendor process manager. Before that, wasn't quite a manager, but I maintained the vendor master file, performed vendor adds and changes. And so in my last position, I was that vendor process manager, or the exact title was senior AP manager over vendor setup and maintenance, or global vendor setup and maintenance. And we had a team of 17, or I had a team of 17, and all we did was vendor setup and maintenance requests. We processed about 2,000 per month, and we also maintained 140,000 active vendors across 7 different ERPs. And so, yes, that was 7 different vendor master files. And by the way, we did used to clean those on a monthly basis. Just saying, I did have a lot of staff though. So when I talk about managing the vendor process, building controls, managing risk, and maintaining accurate vendor data, I actually had I started off a little bit better than what I have seen others, and maybe you too, right, start off with. Sometimes, right, you go into those positions and there's nothing. There's no instructions. There's a person that probably has been there forever and they can tell you how they do it, but there's no really, training or instructions around what should be done for your company. And so I know that I was, a little better off, or actually a lot better off than what I've seen some other teams or some other managers or team members. And so today I wanted to address that with this topic and give you some free options that can help to implement this approach. So, whether you are new to the vendor setup and maintenance process, or you've been doing it for a while, I think today's approach to, avoiding payment fraud, avoiding regulatory fines, and also just making sure that your vendor data gets clean and stays that way, I think everyone will find at least something here of value that you can take back. But I will tell you, especially for those new folks, because I have been there. Number one, there's no one way to do it. It's different. And that can depend on your company, your industry, your leadership at your company. It could depend on where your vendors are located, your vendor mix overall. And so, what that really means is that everyone needs to look at their vendor process and identify what's going to work for them. And so today we're going to talk about what I consider a practical 4-step approach to do that, so that, again, you avoid fraud, you avoid regulatory fines, and you avoid bad vendor data. So we are going to start with step one, and that is really getting training. Now, whether that is for you, especially if you are new to the vendor setup and maintenance process, you need to know what I consider some essential trainings. And not just you, if you have new team members or even if you have existing team members that really never had any training in the vendor setup and maintenance process, everyone needs what I consider foundational vendor process training or training for the team that adds vendors and that changes existing vendors and really that maintains the vendor master file. And that training should definitely include cybersecurity awareness training, but it also should include additional trainings on authentication techniques, best practices, internal controls, uh, vendor validations, those things that are unique to the vendor process that can help to avoid fraud. For example, when the fraudster, is in the vendor's actual email account, and so sends a request to change banking from that account. That's not going to be picked up with cybersecurity awareness training. I mean, we do still have lazy fraudsters out there, so you do still need cybersecurity awareness training, but you also need other things in place in case that fraudulent email is not spotted, either because we're just too busy and get a lot of emails, or there are no red flags like typical we've seen in past years, because the fraudsters are evolving. And so they need to know, you need to know what can be done after that fraudulent email is received but not detected in order to still avoid payment fraud. And the same thing when you're getting invalid information from your point of contact at your actual vendor's place of business, which happens a lot as well, because a lot of times they're giving you that information and they're just trying to check the box, right? They don't really want to give you a W-9, but you keep asking for it. And so they fill it out with the name that's on the invoices along with the tax ID, but they don't know that the vendor is set up a different way, that what's on the invoice is actually the DBA, and with the IRS, they're set up with their actual legal name. But the point of contact is just trying to give you and your team a W-9 to check that box. And so you need to know, your team needs to know how to avoid that payment fraud and how to avoid setting up or entering invalid information in the vendor master file. So find a framework, find some training for that foundational information. Now, there are 3 other types of foundational information. I think every vendor team member that, again, processes vendor adds, vendor changes, and maintains the vendor master file They also need to know how to accept or what to look for when accepting W-9s and W-8s from your vendors or the equivalent vendor setup forms that could be substitute W-8s and W-9s. I do recommend those, by the way. But you need to know, and the team needs to know when they are filled out correctly, especially non-US vendors, because sometimes they haven't really even heard of the IRS. And so the W-8s, they have, different versions of it. Your vendor may not even know which version they need to complete. And so what I found when I was a vendor process manager, I found that not only did the vendors not know how to fill out the W-9s in some cases, in a lot of cases, the W-8s, but when they sent them back to my team members didn't know if they were even filled out correctly. And so that's where the need for this type of training comes. And, I see it all the time. I have a lot of questions that come into me from subscribers, from clients about whether or not the W-8s or the W-9s are valid. And so those questions are real, and you need to make sure that you get your team training and yourself training as well, especially if you're a new manager or if you've never had training on accepting those forms. Because if it's incorrect and you pay the vendor, your company could be susceptible to not only compliance fines if tax reporting is done with those vendors and the legal name tax ID does not match, or via withholding. And so, if you are supposed to withhold on a vendor but you do not, the IRS can make your company liable not only for the amount that you should have withheld, but by the time they find out, there may be penalties and interest assessed on it as well. And so that foundational training is necessary. And there's one other what I consider foundational or essential training, and that is a internal control or steps that you need to take that will avoid a fraudulent payment. The email request or the request is not identified as fraudulent. And so I provide that and I call it the bank of AP because, where does everybody go to get money? The bank. So where do the fraudsters go to get money? AP, because they usually have the vendor set up and maintenance process. And that is where the remittance details are changed. And so there needs to be some internal controls that surround that change process, not just the confirmation call. I don't think that it shouldn't be done. I do think that it should be done. But if the confirmation call were a silver bullet, right, for avoiding fraud, we would not even be having this conversation. And so it's not. And so I think that there needs to be some additional control surrounding that confirmation call. And that I think is foundational training because fraudsters really target the team that can make the remittance changes in the vendor master file. And so whatever team that is that handles that part of the vendor process, they need not only the other essential or foundational trainings, but also this as well. And so I would make sure that you start with a foundation of training. Now, I'm going to put in the show notes a link to all four of those training sessions that I consider essential trainings for the vendor setup and maintenance team or the vendor process team or team members. And you can check that out if you are interested. All right. So that was step one, is to just get training, become knowledgeable about what needs to be done in your vendor process. Now, step two is to clean up your vendor master file. Now, I actually originally thought about having this as step three, and you'll see why when we get to step three. But cleaning up your vendor master file will actually tell you some things that you need to know about your vendors. And so the first thing it'll tell you is it'll tell you what your vendor mix is, right? So, how many vendors do you have that are active? How many vendors do you have that are duplicate? How many vendors do you have that should be inactivated? How many vendors do you have that are non US versus US vendors? Now, because you've taken that foundational training, you kind of know what to look for and how to clean your vendor master file. That's one. But you also, again, know what to look for. You know how to identify which vendors should be inactive. You know how to identify which vendors are duplicate vendors, and you know what to do with those duplicate vendors in order to resolve them. And so, cleaning your vendor master file, this is the perfect time, right, to not only clean them up, but also get familiar with the type of vendors that you have in your vendor master file. Not to mention the fact that this is the step that lots of folks just don't do. And I get it. I understand why. A lot of times the accounting systems and ERPs do not have a automated way to clean the vendor master file. A lot of it is not even, or the part where you might think it would be automated, and that's inactivating, right, vendors that you haven't had activity with in whatever threshold months you determine 15, 18, 24, 36. Don't recommend more than that. But not only do they not have a automatic way to do that, but the other parts of the process is really very manual anyway. And so, even if you do have an automated way to inactivate your vendors during the rest of the process, which is right doing the or performing all of the revalidations, right, to make sure that the vendor hasn't changed any information that they didn't let you know about. But reviewing duplicate vendors, it's a little bit easier now that you have you hopefully you have some artificial intelligence or AI that can help you do that. But you do still have to review those vendors. A human needs to go through, even if you have identified which vendors are duplicates, you've identified which vendors you need to follow up with in order to get updated information because their vendor validations were not successful. A lot of that is really very manual. And so I get it. And I also get the fact that many people think I am crazy because my recommendation is that you clean up your vendor master file once a month. It makes it a lot easier that way. If you wait until, annual cleanup, you're going to have way more work to do. And a lot of times that happens at the end of the year. And what do you have at the end of the year? A lot of you are, processing for year end, and it's chaotic anyway. But you do it because you've got tax reporting in January, and so you're trying to get everything done or that done at the same time. You haven't, cleaned your vendor master file all year, so it's more that you have to look at. And if you just did it on a monthly basis or even on a quarterly basis, what you would have to do at each time decreases, right? The volume decreases. So I do recommend you do it on a monthly basis. But I get it. It's very manual, but it does need to be done. And I believe in that so much that I have provided a free training session called 8 Steps to Clean Your Vendor Master File. And I will put a link to that in the show notes. All right. So in step one, or the first part, we talked about getting a foundation of the vendor process and training that includes, right, how to avoid fraud, how to avoid fines, how to avoid bad vendor data via authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, and vendor validations. And so, if you were to take, for example, the 4-hour workshop that I have that goes through 5 authentication techniques, 30 internal controls, 18 vendor validations, 18 best practices. There are some that I know you would say, "You know what? We should be doing those." And so step 3 is how to use those to plug up your control gaps, really to redesign your vendor processes so that you are adding in those authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, vendor validation, so that you do avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. And so I will say that out of all of those that I talked about of each, right, 30 internal controls, 5 authentication techniques, 18 vendor validations, and 18 best practices, you're not going to need all of those. And so the key is that you need to review your entire process and figure out which ones apply to you and then where they need to be put or what steps they need to be put into your process, again, to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. And so the redesign process should focus on strengthening your vendor, ad procedures, establishing formal vendor change processes, procedures, defining required documentation, standardizing, right? What's in your vendor master file, standardizing how it's collected, the how the data is entered into your vendor master file, determining which vendor validations you need to do. And so this is probably the longest step, but it really needs to be done. And once you do it, you should come out of that process with process maps or process flows so that everyone knows how or what your process should be, again, to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. And on top of that, for every process flow or process map, you should have a desktop procedure where you document the process, for example, for adding a vendor, for changing a vendor, for cleaning the vendor master file. And there can be, multiple different process flows, process maps, desktop procedures, right, for all of your functions. For example, you could have a vendor ad process, but maybe you have international vendors or maybe you have board member vendors. You know what? Each of those vendors may be onboarded in a different way. So you may have different process flows, process maps, and related desktop procedures for different vendor types. The goal is to identify what your processes are, what gaps you have, and then fill those gaps. And when you are done with that, you will come out with a process that should help you to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. But not only that, it should be standardized with documented procedures that will help your team members follow the same process. And it does make that process auditable. All right. That actually segues us to the fourth and last step. And that is now that you know a foundation in the vendor process, you've cleaned your vendor master file, you've updated your vendor processes to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So now your, vendor master file that you cleaned will stay clean. You need to put a vendor audit or vendor process audit in place. You know why? One, because you need to make sure that all vendor team members, anybody that touches the vendor master file, vendor adds, vendor changes, cleaning the vendor master file, that they are all following the process that is in place 100% of the time. And so what is measured is improved. And so you put an audit in place to compare the completed request against the documented desktop procedures to verify that the process was followed. Now, the other thing that this can do, so one was to make sure that the team members followed the process, but two, when the audit is complete, then you can use that as a way to show that you are complying with different requirements, such as, right, the NACHA fraud monitoring rule, making sure that you can show that your team members are following the process that you put in place to be compliant with that rule. Now, if you are not familiar with the NACHA fraud monitoring rule, then guess what? I have a webinar for you. This is something that went into place for everyone as of June 22nd, 2026. And so I will put a link to a free webinar so you can get up to date on that. And then in addition to that, I do have a webinar about implementing a vendor process audit. So this is how you can do that. And again, I will put a link to that in the show notes. All right. So, what are the results when you are trained and your team members are trained in a framework for vendor setup and maintenance? When you clean your vendor master file, when you redesign your vendor processes to plug up those gaps that might result in fraud, fines, or bad vendor data, when you add that vendor process audit to make sure that those authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, vendor validations you put into place to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data are being followed. So, number one, congratulations. But number two, at that point, you have a knowledgeable and confident team. You have a cleaner vendor master file. You have stronger vendor add and change processes. You have improved internal controls. You have reduced your payment fraud risk. You have lower regulatory exposure, and you have continuous monitoring through auditing. And don't forget, I have for each one of these steps something that will help you do it at no cost in the show notes. So, thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 398th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.